Please welcome producer Alexandra Moss and co-director of Fauci, Janet Tobias.
So, yes, we did a film that was finished in 2017 on the 21st century threat of pandemics. And as we finished that, we went out and did some press, and Dr. Fauci and I were paired together at a couple of events. And he liked the film enough to say, well, it would be interesting to work with you. And I was like, oh, my father, a scientist, would be so proud. So I have to figure out something to do with him. And we started a project first on AIDS vaccine research and trials in South Africa. But in getting to know Tony Fauci, it became apparent that his life was an incredible story that needed to be told. So I asked him in December of 2018 if he would let me and our group do a film about him. And in the way of documentaries, we started, 9 months later, and started to do some filming, and then the pandemic happened. And with that, I was smart enough to know that we needed to team up with really good people, that it would be a much more complicated and bigger operation, and he was becoming a household word. And so I teamed up with Story Syndicate and with my co-director John Hoffman, and with Ali, and then we all set to work in very complicated circumstances.
And when did you come on board in the process?
It was February of 2020.
Right before lockdown.
Yep, a good 6 weeks before lockdown.
Mhm.
I had produced a number of projects with the NIH, with John Hoffman, with my husband, John Barden, who's head of creative for Story Syndicate. And a number of them had featured Dr. Fauci. And so we knew his story in a way that I felt most Americans didn't know his story. And it was clear to me in February of 2020 that by whenever we got to the end of this thing, which still hasn't ended, but everybody in America, if not the world, would know his name. I mean, I had no idea how many people would love him or hate him. But I knew that there was more to this man than what we were seeing on the news and, hearing on the radio. And I knew there was a really deep story there to tell. And so, I talked to my husband, we called up John Hoffman, and John Hoffman called the NIH, and they said, well, there's already a wonderful director making a film about Tony. Do you know Janet Tobias? And he did, from the time that we all spent at Discovery, actually. And they teamed up and we teamed up, and we just sort of hit the ground running. I remember on March 22nd, I was baking a birthday cake for my next door neighbor who was in our pod, and also finding an Airbnb in DC for Janet and Zach to go live in indefinitely during lockdown.
And your co-director, John Hoffman, is someone who I spoke to him briefly a few weeks ago. He remembers that era of HIV/AIDS well, and he's done a number of HIV prevention documentaries back then, and also was an activist. So I'm wondering, in coming to this project, how did you kind of divide up the work, both research and directing?
John is a gay man who went through the AIDS pandemic, and was there at the beginning, and knew he had to do something, and did some of the earliest AIDS prevention films. He worked at New York Hospital, and then he sort of went back to his life in film, and has dedicated his life to films about health at HBO, about Alzheimer's, about obesity. Some of the big series that are his, and Ali was a part of them too. So John had I think what I tell people about John is that in his bones he understood the arc of the story that you see Tony go through, because whether you were a nurse or a doctor or a gay man or someone who loved any of those people, there was a horrific arc from not understanding the virus to people dying and you're not being able to do anything, to stigma of wide groups of people, including people who got blood transfusions, which a lot of people forget. And John, had that in his bones. So it was really easy. And John loves archives. So one of the things we divided up is John is a researcher extraordinaire in archive. I went and had the great privilege of living in Washington with Tony Fauci. So, like all of you who live in a bubble during the pandemic and in the lockdown, is Tony Fauci lived in a bubble. He had his secretary, his tech person, his security detail, sadly, his wife. And that was it. And I got to join that bubble with Zach and another Zach Wood, who was our sort of sound second camera. And that was an extraordinary thing to spend a year in Washington at the NIH with Tony Fauci.
I mean, he's obviously no stranger to camera or talking in front of crowds to press conferences, but it's one thing to do all that and another thing when you have a camera in the room intimately following you. So how comfortable was he with your presence, kind of following him around? How open was he to that process?
He is who he is in front of the camera. I mean, Zach would say is that he plays with candy. He, ignores you. He would sing to Barbra Streisand when he was working occasionally on weekends, which is not in the film. But he really is so focused. He has a laser focus. It's really rare that he didn't pay attention to the camera a great deal of time. Obviously, there were calls we couldn't film and meetings we couldn't film. But when we were around, he was remarkably unaware.
So it sounds like you went into this project first thinking it will be one thing, obviously, then the COVID happened, and you wanted to have the two pandemics sort of define the arc of his life. Can you talk about the process of braiding those two narratives together? Because this documentary has an incredible structure. It both contrasts the two time periods, but also it finds a lot of similarities about the human experience and what he went through, and most importantly, how he grew from one to the next.
Well, we should have Amy answer this.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
But
the editor is here.
But our editor, but we're going to give it to Alex.
No, we knew from the beginning, at least from when I came on, that it was really about these two pandemics. And we wrestled with that structure for a really long time because COVID is what we're all going through right now. But HIV/AIDS is incredibly important in having shaped Tony's life. And in having set the stage for so much of the research that led us eventually to an mRNA vaccine in 11 months for COVID. We would never have been sitting in this theater right now if not for HIV/AIDS and the ACT UP activists. And so, the other thing is I'm 38. I remember, sort of the mid-'80s, but I didn't know what was going on, and I'm not even that young anymore. And so we felt like it was really, really important to tell the story of HIV/AIDS from the beginning and Tony's role in that and how he bridged divides that people thought were insurmountable. And so that's something that I take away from this film and think about, what lessons can we learn from Tony Fauci? It's not so much the scientific ones. It's about how do you bring together people who, seem diametrically opposed and get them to recognize that they share common aims and common goals. And Tony is a bit pessimistic on how we can do that as a country now. But I think the fact of our current state of divisiveness is one of the reasons why telling that story of Tony's evolution through AIDS is so critical.
I mean, one of the things that really strikes you watching that movie is how good a listener he is as a person, and maybe that's one of the things that we lack today. He was open to criticism, some very rightful criticism of the government's response to the pandemic back then, and he was able to take that journey. I'm wondering, he watched this documentary, I'm assuming. Was that hard for him to relive this era and then kind of just going through the COVID in a very compact way? How did he respond?
No, he watched, he actually hasn't seen the very final version, but he saw a version right before we went to post. And, he was happy. He said, actually, I am glad that you didn't make me out to be a perfect person because I'm not perfect. So both he and his wife saw it, and then his 3 daughters saw it, which was a very emotional experience for them. As you can all imagine, They were tiny, tiny children and born during the AIDS epidemic, and to see their father. And I will tell you a private thing, which is after the daughters saw it, each of them then went on a walk with their father, which made me really, really happy because they were all talking about what it was to see who their father was.
What was the process for both of you to gain his trust? Because, you mentioned earlier he is who he is that you see on camera, and he even cries in front of camera. This is a person that we looked at in the past 2 years like a divine figure that is going to save us, but we see him as a vulnerable man, which is great to see. How did he get there with both of you and your co-director too?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for me and for John Hoffman for sure, which is that, we had a track record of working with NIH, which sort of gave us entree to Tony in a way that, a perfect stranger who hadn't done all of this work about public health with the NIH wouldn't have had. But, you said one of the remarkable things about Tony is his ability to listen, and that's one of the most important qualities in a documentary filmmaker as well. And so we listened to Tony. We learned from him, and his wife Chris says in the film that when she was a nurse, everybody knew if Tony, if you were treating one of Tony's patients, you better watch out. And we've heard stories from others who've worked for him over the years. He has incredibly high standards, and we felt duty bound as the people who had the privilege of telling his story to do our best. And we made that clear to him every step of the way. And, hopefully we didn't fail him. But that, I think he saw that in us. He saw our dedication. He didn't know, but if he'd known that our AP Madeline Rosenberg had created a 300-page spreadsheet timeline of his life in, excruciating detail, he would have been impressed. And it's research like that and an attention to detail like that that really gained those of us who hadn't known him quite as well as Janet before COVID, entry into his world.
And with you, what was it like to build a kind of chemistry together so that he would trust you in front of the camera?
I would say, yeah, two things is that when we went down in March, it was an extremely stressful time. He was sleeping 4 hours a night. He was at task force meetings 7 days a week, and as complicated as they were. And so in that time period, he said to me from the first day, you can film when I say that it's possible, but I want you to do nothing. Nothing can interfere with my work. And I will stop if it interferes with your work. So Zach and I think it is, we all understood that was much more important than what we were doing, frankly. And so that we worked slowly and carefully to understand what his days were like, how we could integrate. And Zach is a miraculously good person at observing people. And there was not a moment that he asked Zach to, kicked him out or stopped. So, and then I would say about John is what I said at the beginning is, John and Tony went through a similar version of the AIDS crisis, right, as doctor and as a gay man. And so in those moments you see around particularly HIV, I think there was a shared emotional experience that could leverage, and that our team had built up a level of Tony's knowing that we could be trusted, that we were in his daily life. And so that's how I think it came to be.
You gain the sense that, and he has to be this way, he is an optimistic man, Dr. Fauci, but you also mentioned that he has some doubts about bridging some of the divides today. I'm wondering if there is anything that you could share about where his head is at these days and what he thinks the next step could be right now, because we have this free, proven, safe vaccine and there are still people refusing it. I'm wondering if you have spoken to him lately, what he thinks about all that on a personal level.
I mean, I'll let Janet take what he's thinking personally, but I know from speaking with Peter Staley last week at Telluride that one of the things that Tony is doing behind the scenes is doing his best to push to get vaccines manufactured in this country and distributed around the world. He hints at it in the film. It's essentially what he did with PEPFAR for AIDS, and we're not. There's both a public health and moral imperative to do so, and Tony always operates on both of those axes in parallel. And so I know that that's a big part of what he's thinking about, even without having spoken to him since July. But I'm sure Janet has a later take on.
I think Jenny, his daughter, sums him up the best. Is he is all in, and he will be all in until we are through this pandemic. He hasn't taken a day off since January of 2020. And that is how, and he's all in as a physician thinking about what's happening in the field, as a scientist thinking about the next booster or all the variants, as a communicator wanting to be out there every day, making sure that people get as accurate information as possible, and as a leader with a very large team. So
The Telluride Film Festival you mentioned, I was there too, and I heard he was very close to coming to Telluride, but then he got busy, and I wondered, I wonder with what he got busy. But watching this film, both in Telluride and when I screened it earlier, I couldn't help but think that there's also an inspiring, thread here. I thought about all the young people who will be watching this film and maybe inspired by it. I feel like a lot of people will watch it and will want to become doctors and scientists one day. I wonder if you have been showing it to young people or in classrooms or hearing any stories along these lines.
I mean, that was absolutely one of our goals in making it. All of us have a background in storytelling about science and health, and feel really passionately that it's critical for our future as a species that young people, feel good about going into those kinds of professions and into public service more generally. There are plans for an impact campaign that will reach classrooms sort of at all levels. But I can speak from my experience as a mother. My older daughter is 7 3/4, and she's watched the film, and she wants to be a doctor just like Tony Fauci.
Oh, there you go.
So, I hope we get it into classrooms, as young as third graders even, although we might have to bleep a few things.
I mean, that's definitely very inspiring. And what about the part of the country, or the part of the divide where they're just so against everything that he is advocating that they wouldn't even listen? If they were to watch Fauci, what are you hoping that they would get away from this movie? Because you portray him very honestly about his flaws and perfections.
At Telluride, 2 nurses came up to me, one from Colorado and one from Texas, in their 50s, and they were saying, isn't there any way you can have it in theaters in Colorado and Texas? And I said, no, because we really have to have vaccine and masking requirements, and they don't exist in theaters in those states. And they said, we really wish you could, because we think you would change some minds. And one of them described how she had a relative who wouldn't get vaccinated and is now in the hospital with COVID. But saying, and the answer is it will ultimately go to streaming, and I really do hope that people will see it from a broad sector. Susan Rice in the film told me personally that she has no idea what political party Tony has ever voted for, and she doesn't know anyone who does. And so I would really want people across different political spectrum to see it.
Yeah, and Disney Plus will hopefully help with that.
Hopefully. You have quite a colorful array of interviews in the movie, from Bono to Bill Gates to W. How did you gather all those people together? I'm assuming that a lot of it was done under COVID restrictions.
All of it was done under COVID restrictions. Yeah. It was, I've done outreach to potential subjects for a lot of documentaries. This was the easiest one. You asked anybody, do you want to be in our film about Tony Fauci? And their answer was, I love Tony. Absolutely. Let's make this work. And so, we obviously interviewed Tony in person under strict COVID protocols at the NIH in Bethesda many times, although to the point of not wanting to distract him. It was typically on Friday evenings and Saturday mornings, which are normally work hours for him, but at least he didn't have as much incoming. But we filmed remote interviews, like the crew was in person, but our team didn't travel, in Seattle, in Dublin, in Kampala, which was at like 4 in the morning, and I'm on Zoom and half awake at my, desk in my bedroom, producing a shoot in Kampala. The situations that you find yourself in during COVID are very interesting. And then for W, our extraordinary DP, Claudia Rashka, and I flew sort of before the winter wave to Dallas to do the interview with W. But our directors came remotely via iPad, and it's amazing the technological evolution that's happened during COVID, in terms of not needing to travel as much and being able to still produce beautiful, emotional and raw interviews. But I'm looking forward to producing again in a hopefully post-COVID world.
In an in-person way.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, to close off, with the interview is, I think W's involvement is especially remarkable because public health issue is not something that we should be divided on. We should come together because until everybody is safe, nobody is safe. One of the messages of the movie from the AIDS crisis. Were you thinking along those lines when you were actually involving him? Because that is not going to be possible with Trump, or would not ever been possible with Trump.
So
Were
why
you,
we went to W?
I mean, were you thinking along the lines that,
should we ask Trump?
No, his W's involvement is actually very remarkable, and that would never happen today with the past Republican president that we just had.
I mean, it was clear to us from the beginning that PEPFAR was a huge moment for Tony in his life, in his career, and for the world. And we couldn't really tell that story without going to W. And so, also he agreed immediately. I mean, he is a huge fan of Tony's. And frankly, sitting there as a, liberal producer from New York in the Bush Center in Dallas, interviewing this guy, it made me a little uncomfortable. But it's very clear to me that if there's a single unmitigated good act that came out of that administration, it's PEPFAR.
And I would just say that I think it was really important is Tony has worked with now 7 presidents and innumerable Congresses, and he has friends on both sides of the aisle. And there were actually other people on our list who were Republican, none of them, a former president. But I think it was really important because that is one of Tony's masterful skills, he's not partisan, but he does know how to navigate through political systems with an expertise that is really rare, right? So.
He has to be a politician too sometimes in order to navigate his job. Thank you so much for this conversation, Alexandra and Janet. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming to see the movie.
Thank you all.
Please tell everyone to come see it, vaccinated and masked, of course. Thank you.